Howdy historians, how you doing? Mr. Montgomery here, getting ready to bring you a flip lesson about the emergence of political parties in the early republic. Pick out your favorite, tell me what it is tomorrow out of our favorite hypothetical animal and insect and mammals over here for political parties. I like the amoeba party, that one looks pretty good to me. We're going to see how a division among some early historical figures that you Hamilton fans know all too well eventually lead to the rise of political parties in the United States. But first, a couple reminders before we get rocking and rolling here. First off, for those of you following along with the lecture outline, which you all should be, we are in Unit 3, Part 4. So we are in between Washington and Adams presidencies, looking at the origins of political parties, and then we'll see the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Really, they called themselves Jeffersonian Republicans, but now we call them Democratic Republicans, so that way we don't confuse them with modern Republicans, which is kind of confusing within itself. But there you can see where we are on the lecture outline, and our normal flip lesson reminders. Make sure that you've got your vocabulary defined so that way you can understand the information that I'm about to present in a more full and comprehensive manner. Also, make sure that you take notes as we go. You can pause this bad boy, take advantage of that functionality because you can't do it during class, so use it. And of course, answer the wrap-up questions after watching and bring all these materials to class tomorrow. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into it and see how political parties start to emerge in the early republic. So first thing, as we get ready with our introduction here, the framers of the Constitution, had an idea of temporary factions, but they really didn't have too much of an idea that political parties would eventually form in the United States. They actually found them to be contrary to effective government. Many of the founders had even warned against the negative consequences of factions and political parties. The Federalist Papers had done so, and many thought that they kind of went against the unified spirit of American identity that was emerging after the Revolution. So many people that were framing the early government didn't think that political parties would necessarily occur, but there was this idea, of course, that there would be temporary factions that would rise up. So as we start to look at the origins of these political parties, we can look at some of these early factions that we've already looked at in class already, and those are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The debate between these two groups, this was the first hint that parties were on their way. But again, it wasn't uncommon for these temporary factions to spring up during colonial times or during the Articles of Confederation to get things done. They'd spring up, they'd have a specific goal, and then they would somewhat dissolve. But in the 1790s, it was pretty clear that political parties were forming around Hamilton's fiscal policies. So, as Hamilton had established the government's sound credit through things like funding at par, assumption, the excise tax on whiskey, the first bank of the United States, this had created a lot of opponents. Of course, the best known, Thomas Jefferson. You can check out the cabinet battle from A. Ham and the musical to get some more info on that. But his opponents really favored more state rights. They thought that Hamilton's fiscal policies had gone too far, they thought the government was getting too big, and they thought that the government was turning into a juggernaut on the federal level that was going to absolutely trump states' rights and take all the power away from them. So out of the debate between Hamilton and his opposition, the modern two-party political system started to emerge. Now, something that really fueled this emergence were newspapers. Newspapers were popular, they're an important part of American identity, even from our colonial days until now, and newspapers helped fuel the division and growth of these different policies and of these two different groups. And what we saw here was the two-party system starting to emerge, and when it's functioning well, the two-party system really can serve as another check and balance because it can establish the loyal opposition. The loyal opposition, of course, is the party who's not in power that can check and balance the party who is. So the two groups that we're going to see emerge here are the Jeffersonian Republicans or the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. We'll just call them the Democratic Republicans in class, and the Hamiltonian Federalists. Just sounds so elitist, Hamiltonian Federalists. But these two groups emerge, and what we want to do now is see what they stand for as we get ready to see them start to operate in the two-party system. So we start with the Federalists. So a couple prominent leaders of the Federalists. Of course, Alexander Hamilton is one. John Adams is another. Here's like a picture of like a middle-aged John Adams. I always like to find some of the more obscure pictures. When it came to their view of the Constitution, the Federalists favored a loose interpretation of the Constitution so that way they could provide for a strong central government. When it came to their foreign policy, they were very pro-British. We're going to see one side be pro-British, the Federalists, the other side, the Democratic Republicans, would be more pro-French. And a lot of that dealt with the economic ties that were involved between the United States and the British, and different views about the French Revolution. When it came to their military policy and ideas, the Federalists favored a large peacetime army and a navy. So they just saw it as a necessary evil, if you will. When it came to their domestic policy, they wanted to aid business. They thought that this would lead to the most success for the country and give the government the firmest footing. They favored the national bank, and they also favored tariffs as a way to insulate American industry and also provide funding for the government. When it came to their supporters, those people in America that found themselves gravitating towards their platform, we saw a lot of northern businessmen, large landowners, more of the elites and the well-educated in society. So the Federalists picking up one side of the American sphere here when it comes to politics. Now on the other side, we had the Democratic Republicans. For the Democratic Republicans, their leaders included Thomas Jefferson and also James Madison. This is very middle-aged James Madison. I also kind of like the very old James Madison, but no one wants to be remembered that way. Remember that, young people. Also, when it came to the views of the Constitution for the Democratic Republicans, they favored a strict interpretation, and they wanted a weaker central government with more power going to the states. This will be interesting when we get to Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and then suddenly he's not so strict in his interpretation of the Constitution, but that happens to a lot of politicians. Very difficult to maintain campaign promises and long-term promises when you have an extended political career. When it came to the Democratic Republicans and their foreign policy, they are pro-French. You can again check out one of the cabinet battles between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson from the musical Alexander Hamilton about this one. They wanted to support the French in their revolution against the monarch, but as we learned, this was kind of a moot point because Washington had issued his neutrality proclamation. We just didn't have enough to gain, and we were not strong enough as a country to support the French in their revolution. And as you know from your previous history classes, there was really no clear winner in that revolution, and it turned out to be a double-dip revolution with lots of negative consequences. In the long run, it was probably better that we didn't get involved. When it came to military policy, the Democratic Republicans favored a small peacetime army and navy. Again, they're working off their remembrance of the events leading up to the American Revolution. If we are not fighting in a war, there's no need for a large peacetime army and navy that's only if it's there, it's going to have opportunities to be used against the people, so it can only be a mode of oppression and tyranny. So they want to keep the standing army and navy small in peacetime. When it comes to their domestic policy, they're in favor of supporting agriculture. They do not like the national bank, and because they support agriculture, they oppose tariffs. And we're going to get more about that later in class, why those two go hand in hand. Their chief supporters, those who are supporting them, a lot of skilled workers and artisans, small farmers, and plantation owners. So you can see from their platform why these groups would clearly support them. So these are the two groups that rise up in early American history. Now, political parties are going to twist and turn and change a lot throughout our history. We're going to have this early system. Eventually, we're going to go into an era known as the era of good feelings, where there's basically only one party operating for a period of time. Then we're going to go into the second party system, where again we have two parties that are fighting against each other for seats, presidents, sway, influence, votes, etc., all the way until where we are today. But this is where it all gets its start, with the Federalists and with the Democratic Republicans and with the opposition and debate over Hamilton's financial measures. So, as we look ahead, Why this is going to matter is because we're getting ready for a couple important elections. The election of 1796 is going to be between Thomas Jefferson over here on our left, our Democratic Republican, and John Adams, an older John Adams on our right there as a Federalist. And again, you can see some of their platform here on the bottom. It's going to be a very heated, nasty political election. And then probably the more important election is going to be the election of 1800, where some people, most historians I should say, even call it the Revolution of 1800, because we're going to see a peaceful transfer of power based on undisputed election results, a hallmark of our democracy and any democracy around the world. So these parties are going to have lots of influence moving forward throughout the year, both in first and second semester, and as we know, still have lots of influence today. So important to understand where they came from and where these early parties line up. So before tomorrow, don't forget to have that vocabulary finished. You don't need to turn it in, but it'll be important as we discuss what you learned and as you go through the flip lesson and the readings. Have those post-lesson questions all wrapped up. You don't need to type them up unless you want to, but prepare to discuss them. If you have questions, be sure to take note of them so that way I can answer them or we can discuss them during class, and then bring all of this to class tomorrow. Take those notes, bring your questions. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace. I'm out of here.